This is Lisa from MobileTechReview, and this is the Alienware M17 R4. So the fourth generation of the 17-inch, relatively speaking, slim, sort of light gaming laptop from Alienware, which is really Dell since they do own Alienware. This also comes in a 15-inch size as the M15 R4, but today we're going to look at the bigger chassis. So what's new in this generation? Well, the biggest thing is NVIDIA RTX 3060, 3070, and 3080 graphics inside, and also the fact that we don't use Max P and Max Q anymore, NVIDIA says, but they are basically the Max system, Max P versions, with our RTX 3070 having a 140-watt GPU inside. If you go for that RTX 3080 with 16 gigs of VRAM, it's 165 watts. That outdoes even the MSI GE76 Raider 17-inch that we reviewed, which had a 155-watt RTX 3080. The design obviously is the same. It's the same Legend design available in your choice of Lunar Light, which this is, or Dark Side of the Moon, with the so-called Endurance Clear coat, so you can eat your Doritos and not destroy your laptop's finish. And that is magnesium alloy for the casing underneath, despite the fact it might look to you like plastic. So how are the thermals? That's always the thing you want to know with Alienware. So we're going to find out now. But before we talk about thermals and other goodness, there are two other things that are new. Optional Cherry MX switches. So for those of you who like that kind of mechanical keyboard feel, this is like an ultra low travel, relatively speaking, for a mechanical keyboard. It's 1.8 millimeters of travel, which is pretty long for a laptop. That's available to you. Of course, it's going to sound a little more clicky, but for those who like that, they've just introduced that option. Also new is the full HD 360 Hertz refresh 5 millisecond IPS display, which is the one that we have. So that basically replaces the 300 Hertz refresh rate that was available before. Between 15 and 17 inches, there are a few display differences. I'll try to cover those as we talk more about the display later. Also, let's talk about the two elephants in the room. Number one, there is the fact that, well, I mean, there's always a new CPU generation coming, right? But Intel 11th Gen H45, 45-watt mobile CPUs will be coming probably by June. And obviously Alienware, they always update their laptops and they will have that. So while on the desktop, Intel 11th Gen was not really much of an improvement, pretty much architecturally very similar, still 14 nanometer, we do see the drop down to 10 nanometer for Intel 11th Gen H45, the 45-watt, 8-core, 6-core CPUs that are going to be available there. So it could help certainly with thermals, mostly. Not performance probably so much, but a bit with the thermals and perhaps with the battery life. But there's the other elephant in the room. Even more power efficient is Ryzen, of course, with its 7 nanometer process. And Dell has just announced only for the 15-inch that there will be an Alienware M15 R4, which is the Ryzen edition. Unfortunately, that one's gimped in some ways. It doesn't have Thunderbolt 3, which is understandable because so far AMD has not had Thunderbolt reasons. That could change in the future. They did get rid of the Alienware graphics amplifier, which is just as well because, well, Dell discontinued that. But also for the GPUs on that Ryzen model, not Max P. They're lower wattage, and they top out at the 3070. So as Alienware laptops typically appeal to hardcore gamers a lot who want the best performance, most games today, AAA titles, really depend more on the GPU than the CPU, so you want the max wattage, which still makes the Alienware attractive. All right, we got that all out of the way, right? So let's get into it. For the display options on this one, you have the one that we have, the new 360 Hertz, and that has G-Sync. And by the way, this will always get confusing a little bit with Alienwares, and some display options may be available only with some color chassis. Why? Don't know. The rest of the options are what we saw last year. There's a 144 Hertz full HD display. All these are 300 nit, these full HD displays, by the way. That one's 7 millisecond response time. That one's the one that's attractive for those of you who actually care about battery life. Probably more for those of you looking at the M15, which is more portable than the M17, my guess. Anyway, because that one has Optimus, so you can switch. You can use FN, F7, you can switch between dedicated and integrated graphics. If you get our 360 Hertz display, you've got G-Sync and you got dedicated graphics only. Also, there is a 4K UHD wide gamut display option, and that one is 500 nits and 25 millisecond response time and only 60 Hertz. So clearly geared towards content creators. It's a nice enough looking display. The 15-inch will use an OLED, not the 17-inch though. And I actually prefer the 17 inches a little bit better because I don't think that the OLED display is that attractive on the 15-inch. It looks a little old gen, a little bit yellow to me, and too glossy, too shiny. But anyway, that one's not so geared towards gamers. And it's a little bit of a disappointment because Razer has been offering 4K displays with 120 hertz refresh rate, at least for a while. So for those of you who care about a bit higher frame rates over 60, well, that's not an option. But for content creators, the 4K is still there for you as the same. All right, those are our display options. And one last thing to say, ours is pretty good with backlight bleed, but the bottom right corner is more like IPS glow. That corner is a little bit lighter than the rest. We'll talk about the display metrics of ours. It's pretty good. The contrast on this is over 1,000 to 1. It has full sRGB coverage. In fact, it has 83% or so of P3. So it's not that far off color gamut-wise from ASUS's lovely Rogue Zephyrus G15 display, which is a pretty wide gamut display. And the response times on it are obviously quite good. And the G-Sync, for those of you who love G-Sync, well, you're not going to see any tearing here. It's very nice. And as you wonder why you need 360 hertz, right? Even if this laptop could maybe drive CSGO at exceedingly high frame rates or something like that. Even Apex, you can get into mid 100s easily enough for your frame rate. It also offers more multipliers for better syncing of the GPU to the display, so there are other things to say about it. Experientially, to me, it does look a little bit better than last year's 300 hertz option, just a little bit crispier. Metrics-wise, it doesn't look that different, so I don't know why it is, but each generation hopefully does get better. All right, enough of the display. Keyboard, other than the new Cherry MX mechanical option, is the same as last generation. And I still find it a very nice, tactile, and comfortable keyboard with very bright RGB backlighting. You have your option of getting zone backlit or per key. Ours is per key. In fact, ours is a Best Buy model with the 8-core i7 CPU, the RTX 3070, and the per key RGB lighting, and the 360 hertz display. So this one is a retail model. Usually Dell sends us review units, loans us those units so we can review them. So this one has not been cherry-picked for thermals, which will be important when we do get to thermals. Trackpad on this is glass, and it is quite good. It's a Microsoft Precision trackpad. The speakers on it, same as last generation. It does have 4 2-watt speakers, but lacking in bass, definitely. And compared to MSI GE76 Raider that we reviewed, which has those being subwoofers, or woofers, that sounds better, folks. So thank goodness for headphones, and this does have a single headphone jack, not separate mic and headphone jacks like the Area 51M has. It's a 17-inch laptop, even if it is thin and fairly light. It's 6.5 pounds, but you know. Anyway, you've got your Ethernet on board, 3 USB-A ports, Thunderbolt 3, the Alienware graphics amplifier that's of no use to anybody anymore. This mini display port 1.4, and yay, HDMI 2.2. So for those of you who have those fancy 4K OLED 120 hertz displays, you can actually connect that up in game. The negatives with this design, to keep it so thin and light, RAM is soldered on here still. 16 or 32 gigs of DDR4 2933 megahertz RAM. That's your 2 options, dual channel. And you've got at least several M.2 SSD slots. You've got 2 full-size ones, and in fact you can order with RAID 0 if you want. And then there's a half-height slot in there. So storage expandability is good. The Wi-Fi card is a killer Wi-Fi 6 card, and it's actually an Intel card, and that is soldered down too. So boo on that, because we like to see upgradable laptops, but then this is how they're making it so thin and light. You know the story with this until they change the design, if they ever do, like they did with the Ryzen edition. We'll see. We still have vapor chamber and cooling for the CPU inside, and we still have the inverted motherboard. So if you wish to repaste it, you're going to have to take the motherboard completely out. Even MSI got rid of that with their Stealth series, so I really would like to see Alienware find a way around that. We'll see. We'll see. Maybe with Intel's more power-efficient CPUs, they won't need as much space for cooling. They might be able to do that. Yeah. All right, let's talk about cooling and performance, because that is probably why you are here. It's better than I expected. Okay, for generations now, I have moaned about Alienware laptops, the thin ones, not the Area 51M, particularly the R2, which is a 10-pounder with a thick chassis and lots of room for cooling. But the 15 and the 17 have just run hot and loud. And each generation, it gets a little bit better. And finally, with the 4th generation, watch, this will probably be the last with this design, and they'll change it over, and who knows what will happen next. But this thing actually runs decently in terms of thermals and fan noise. So this one, I found that even playing AAA demanding titles like Cyberpunk 2077, I could leave the fans on balance mode without seeing the CPU temperatures get astronomical, which is nice, instead of putting it on high performance for cooling, which guarantees that it's going to go and roar. On balance mode, it ramps up nicely. If you put it in high performance mode, basically the fans are just pegged at a fairly high level, which is stupid because you don't want to do that when you're web browsing, right? Anyway, balance mode does the trick here. Again, this is just a retail sample from a Best Buy store, so not cherry-picked by Dell or something like that. And I was actually shocked at how good the thermals were on this. Playing a game like Cyberpunk, which gets the GPU pretty darn hot and creates heat pollution because you have shared heat sinks here. CPU temperatures in the 70s to mid-80s sometimes. GPU temperatures around 77 Celsius. So that's quite good, and that's without undervolting or anything. Our sample did undervolt pretty well. I used throttle stop on this, and by the way, Alienware does not block you from undervolting. Yay that. So I went to 100 millivolt undervolt on this, or 0.1 really, on the core and cache, and it dropped temperatures down some, but I didn't feel an urge to run an undervolted, so delightful. Now, if you go with the 15-inch one, smaller chassis, hotter, noisier. So don't generalize too much, but I expect to see somewhat better cooling for the 4th generation in the 15-inch. The ones that we have visually to show you is the R3, so that's the last gen. Fan noise is pretty similar to last gen. The fans have the same sonic quality, shall we say, a bit high pitch. It's a thin chassis, so some might find that annoying. I know sometimes I do. It's not screechy and horrible, but you know what I mean. It's not the low whoosh of air for a big old desktop replacement kind of thing. The improvement is that you don't hear them cranked up as high as often, and you don't have to run it on max fans all the time. And we tested a variety of games. You see the footage that's running across here, all sorts of different games, but all of them pretty demanding. So good stuff. In terms of performance, we had the 8-core i7, that's the 10870H, and you can also get it with the Core i9 HK processor, also 8 cores. I advise against that just because, thermally speaking, you're already somewhat constrained here. Why mess with the good thing? The i7 performs pretty well and doesn't thermal throttle, at least ours hasn't. So with the i9, you might be looking at throttling, and then your scores won't be that much better, will they? Or your frame rates in games. When it comes to the GPU, the 3080 with 16 gigs of VRAM and 165 max watts must be a delight. But the 3070 is considerably cheaper and is pretty darn good, as you can see for the frame rates that we got in games. I mean, I'm not feeling like I'm wanting something. In terms of the performance of this laptop, compared to the Alienware Area 51M R2, and this one actually gets 5 to 10 frames better in GPU-intensive games, like Cyberpunk 2077. If you're playing something like Far Cry 5, it's not going to matter as much because that one really hits the CPU more than the GPU. The Alienware Area 51M has a desktop CPU, and the one that we have for comparison and tests is the 10700K overclockable processor there. So in most cases, actually, this one is going to win because of the better GPU, the 3000 series. Maybe when the Area 51M R3 comes out, well, that'll be interesting then. In terms of heat that you feel from the chassis, yes, it does get hot. Now, when I test laptops, I either have them on a stoneware counter or I have them on this passive laptop cooler. There's no fans on this thing, but just to give it a little elevation and to raise it up. So not helping it out too much, but the bottom will get hot. The area above the keyboard, that strip where you're not going to touch when you're gaming, will get quite hot to the touch, even if the core temperatures are perfectly acceptable, like 75 centigrade or something like that. So a thin laptop, toasty to the touch. Yes, it is. Now, because of the shortage of GPUs and for some of the laptops, Ryzen CPUs, there's not a lot to compare this to that's readily available on the market. The MSI GE76 Raider is somewhat available and is another fairly large 17-inch laptop, but it is thicker. The thicker does help with thermals, though to be honest, in my tests and in playing games, I was really shocked about this. I didn't see the CPU running that much cooler. However, I did repaste the MSI, and that did bring temps down, whereas repasting this Alienware would be more of a, what a pain in the neck. Obviously, the MSI has 2 RAM slots and a socketed Wi-Fi card, so that's a plus there. MSI does not have G-Sync for the display for those of you who are a fan of it, however. I like the keyboard better on the Alienware, and the backlighting is a little bit brighter, and I like the touchpad a bit better too. There's going to be some give and take for each. They're both very high-performance laptops. It's going to depend somewhat on your preferred aesthetic and brand between those two, more than anything else, to be honest. Those are two of the most high-performing laptops on the market. When it comes to Ryzen-based laptops like the Asus ROG Strix 17, the problem is you just can't get one, right? I mean, now if you order one, they say maybe you'll get it in June. Obviously, Ryzen has great advantages in terms of better battery life and better thermals. It doesn't run as hot, especially if the cooling solution is pretty decent on it. We did review the Asus ROG Zephyrus G15, which is a surprisingly thin and light 15-inch version, and that one can get toasty because you don't have much room for cooling there. But still, that one was a delight, but we haven't gotten a Strix 17 in for review. The Strix, however, does not have a mux switch, so you're going to be running on switchable graphics at all times. It does have RAM slots, which is nice, though. Choices. Again, the Alienware, at least you can buy on Dell's website. You might have to wait a couple of weeks for it to get to you, and Best Buy is actually stocking them now in the United States. So availability-wise, I think Dell may have a little bit of an advantage there versus the Ryzen ones, until their own Ryzen laptop ships. Okay, how about battery life? This is totally going to vary depending on which display you get. If you get the one that has switchable graphics, obviously your battery life is going to be best. If you get our 360 Hertz display that's running the D GPU all the time, good luck. Battery life is like 2 hours. That's what it is. This is for somebody who doesn't need long battery life but wants the ultimate in performance for the display. If you get the 4K displays just use more power, so that will again become an issue even though it's not a high refresh display. Same as last generation, 86 watt-hour battery. You're going to get either a 240 watt or a 330 watt charger depending on which CPU and GPU you pick. Our i7 with the 3070 comes with the 240 watt power adapter, which is pretty weighty. The 330 watt is something you do not want to drop on your foot. Something to count when you're carrying this thing around. Opening this up is just like the last generation. Unscrew the visible Phillips head screws. This one's a captive screw, so it'll help raise that corner a bit. And then you just lift it up and pull it a little bit forward because there's little tabs that go underneath, well, the fan butt, the fan cover, whatever you want to call it, which you do not have to remove unless you wish to do further disassembly. And as you can hear, that is a metal cover. I know some people think they're plastic given the finish, but metal it is. And here are our internals, two large fans right here, so they are accessible at least if you wish to clean them out. Our boot M.2 NVMe SSD under a copper heatsink supplied at the factory. Here's our second full-size slot, so again you can get this in a RAID 0 configuration if you want. And here's the little 2230 half-height slot. Typically you can find drives up to about 512 gig capacity if you really want to go there. The speaker drivers are visible right over here. The bottom firing ones, again, has 4 total. Heat radiators out the rear and out the side. Air intake from the bottom. 86 watt-hour battery right here. By the way, if you do take off this cover for any reason, be mindful that this little cable here, there's a Tron lighting cable for the rear lighting that you do not want to rip off. Disconnect it from the motherboard if you need to do that. So no RAM slots because RAM is soldered on board, boo that, and the Wi-Fi card is soldered on board there too. So don't expect to see anything exciting here other than the cute little Alienware head logo. So that's the Alienware M17 R4. Obviously a distinctive style with this machine, and you know, it feels like a quality piece. I gotta say, generally speaking, the build quality on this is pretty good. I know some people have problems with quality control and with different brands of laptops, including this, but this is one solid machine. The performance and the cooling on this really impressed me. Well, not the performance, I mean, because I expected a lot. That's something Alienware delivers, but usually at the price of letting the CPU run unchecked to thermal maximum stuff. And the thermals on this were actually pretty darn good. I like the new 360 Hertz display. It might be overkill for most people, but it sure is nice looking. And again, it gives you more multipliers for syncing the display to the GPU more smoothly. And for you content creators, there is that 4K display option, which is very pretty, even if it's not high refresh for gaming too. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more cool tech videos, and thumbs up if you like this vid.